5 best compounds that the company had, but this is what I have in order to meet the goal. So it's more important for me to meet this goal and reach the milestone than was this really the right thing to advance to the clinic. And you may think that that is something that doesn't happen that often, but unfortunately it happens much more often than you might imagine. So there are a lot of misaligned incentives in this world. And today I'm not going to talk about this in any more detail. I've spoken about this in the past here in Singapore, and some of you may have heard me pontificate about it. I thought it was important to put it out there just as background, because what I want to cover today is more about the form in which industry interacts with academia and what have we learned about the different ways in which people work with each other. The misalignment question is important to have it in the back of your head, but that's not going to be the focus of my talk today. Instead, as I said, I'm going to talk about the mechanisms whereby people in pharma or in industry interact with academics. So let me just very broadly and very coarsely, if you wish, define them in 2 ways. Direct mechanisms. So in this case, the company invests directly in the academic project. In the old days, when there was more money, they would give unrestricted grants, right? So they would say, okay, here's some money, go and enjoy. Do your research, and we'll see what comes out of that. So you would get some money. There's now, however, a push for milestone-based investment. So they would give you more money. That's why the bills are of $100 in this image. They would give you more money, but they need to come associated with reaching certain objectives. If the objectives don't follow, then the grant stops. And, fair enough. That's one way to do it. And then there's also another form of contributing is by contributions in kind. I'm going to share with you my chemical library or certain expertise that I have to help you advance your project. And then when you get to a certain milestone and you create some intellectual property, we'll share it. Yeah? So fine. So those are 3 ways in which companies tend to invest directly. Now, I would say that there's an indirect way in which pharma invests in academic projects, and that's when an academic project has been successfully incubated into a biotech company, and then the pharma comes and invests in the biotech or acquires the biotech, right? So, but that's much later. It still involves academic groups. It's still related in a way to science coming out of academia, but it's a little different. The picture at the bottom is Genentech, which would be one of the good examples of this, right? How Genentech initially, Roche invested in it, and at the end of the game, they bought it. So naturally, the question is, what has worked? From these different things, what has worked and what hasn't worked? And I think that it will be easy to agree that from the point of view of getting drugs to market, what has worked is investing in late-stage companies. Yeah, so there's no question. That has led to more molecules in the market. So if that's the case, what does that mean? That academics need to form their own biotech and then hope for the best? That's one way to think about it, but that would be a bit too simplistic. So let me tell you, therefore, some new mechanisms that people have come up with as they interact with, as industry interact with academia. So there are some new ideas that people have been pursuing. In terms of new collaboration strategies, one of them is pre-competitive consortia, and some of you may have heard about the Structural Genomic Consortium, which is a consortium coming out of Canada and Oxford University that involves 10 pharmas where they do very high-risk validation of difficult targets, and which has led to several molecules entering the pipeline of these pharma partners. So this consortium has been very successful there, but it really is very pre-competitive and very early stage. And again, it's complex because it involves a lot of different pharmas. So, it's one way of doing it, and it has been working. So it's worth noting that that's a possibility. Another way in which people have tried to move forward in this field is the creation of innovation centers. Today we heard about J&J, J-Labs. That's a very good example of these kind of innovation centers. Pfizer's CTI is another example. The idea in this case is that you have scientists from industry working side by side with scientists from academia in a facility which is bricks and mortar, right? So that there's more direct interaction between the academic scientists and the pharma scientists. There are many subtle details about how that works, and I'm not going to get into those details now, but that is something that, that people have put as a new way of approaching this kind of relationships. And then the third is a model that some people call build to buy. So what happens in this case, and I put as example this group in Sanofi called Sunrise, what they do is they identify projects in academic centers that are almost ready for launching a company, and then they would attract venture investment together with investment from the pharma company to then create a company that if it reaches a certain milestone, then the company that invested is poised to acquire, right? So that's why it's called build to buy. They help you build a company with a view to buying it at the end. So these are three new ways in which people have been trying to solve this problem. The thing is that personally, I would say that we're still on the fence about which of these work better than which, right? So there are these and other models. Every pharma will have a different way of interacting with academic groups. What works and what doesn't work, I think we're still on the fence, right? So this is something that is worth keeping an eye out for, because there's going to be a lot of action in this space for the next few years. Now, the other new idea that has gradually gained traction in this field of commercializing academic science and interacting with industry, we've heard about, and in fact that was the original idea for this ecosystem day, is the creation of ecosystems, right? Which is, we can define that ecosystem as a region with the necessary ingredients for the creation of biotech companies, right? That's just a broad definition of what an ecosystem might be. So you might be wondering, what are the ingredients that we need to have? So the ingredients I would pose are scientific capital, right? You need science. If you don't have science, then let's do something else. Financial capital, right? You need somebody to invest in this science. And then you need human capital, and I'll get to that in a second, what I mean by human capital. And the other thing, I didn't include it in the slide, but the other thing that you also need, which is certainly very established here in Singapore, is government support, right? So you need a government that believes in this and provides infrastructure and some capital for the ecosystem to be built. So I didn't include it in this presentation because here in Singapore, that's something that is very clearly available. So I'll talk about each of these 3 points in turn, and then I will close by two dilemmas that I've seen in different regions that I visited that try to create these ecosystems. What I call the pregnancy dilemma and what I call the other people's problem dilemma. I'll explain in a second what those are. So in terms of scientific capital, I want to circle back to the Science Cafe, which we just experienced. So Andy and I worked on the Science Cafe for years, back when I was at Nature Medicine. And I think our experience, if we were to summarize it in 1 or 2 sentences, is that there really isn't as much good science out there as you think there is. Every time we try to put together one of these events, we really need to go through a lot of papers before finding enough science to actually fill a program. And this is important because everybody thinks that okay, yeah, there's enough science out there to go and launch companies, everything is critical, everything is novel, and not really, not really. There's not as much science out there as you think there is. So that's important to keep in mind because it's very easy to think that one has enough scientific capital when you don't really have it. In terms of specific examples, we started the Science Cafe in Boston, right? And Boston, as you know, has some of the highest rated academic institutions in the world. And we really had to scrape the barrel every time we did the event to identify enough science to fill the program. And we were talking about 3 or 4 papers every 4 or 5 months. So it was not that easy. So the moral of of this part of the scientific capital is that there isn't as much great commercially viable science as one often assumes there is. Now, in terms of financial capital, I think that a lot has been said about it, and we've heard some things earlier today. I will start by saying that it's very heavily concentrated in very few regions. There's a lot of capital in San Francisco, there's a lot of capital in Boston. Other than that, the rest of the cities that want to invest more in biomedicine are playing catch up. Right? There's some money, of course, but it's not as much as in those regions. Unfortunately, investors tend to spend their money locally. Most of them would invest in projects that are in their backyard. If I'm going to invest in this project that it's based in Denver, and I need to go to a board meeting to Denver every 3 months, I'm not going to be that enthusiastic, frankly. Now, competition for money is global. And what I mean by this is that there are a lot of scientists out there looking for money for their companies. If you have something, again, return to this example in Denver, and it's very attractive to an investor, the investor can say to you, okay, we'll do it, but we need to create the company here in Boston, right? So they will have access to science from everywhere, and they would take it from wherever it is to Boston. So why? Because they can do it. They are the ones with the money, with the expertise, and that's the best you can hope for. So for you as an entrepreneur, that is a bit problematic. And another point is that investors tend to spend their money on people they know. If you are just somebody who has a great paper or a great discovery and go and knock on the door of an investor without any introduction, just, oh, here I am, I just published this great paper, can you please help me start my company? People are not going to help you. So they always tend to go to people they know, the big names in the field, or if your CEO of your company is somebody they trust, then they at least will listen to you. Other than that, forget it. There's just no way that investors are going to pay attention to your proposition. It's a long shot. Fortunately, there are some winds of change, and I think here in Asia, that's quite good. That's where would you have more reasons to be optimistic here? There are, for example, new investors. And earlier today, we heard about several Chinese companies and different people who want to grow their footprint and who want to compete with the existing companies in different parts of the world. So these people may take a chance with your proposition if it offers an advantage over what other people may be doing. The other thing is that the existing ecosystems, like Boston and San Francisco, are really saturated. So if you're a new investor coming to those ecosystems, you're going to find it very hard to compete with the established investors. So if you're really serious about it, you need to move your shop somewhere else. So from that point of view, there may be some more money to have around. So that's not bad. Now, human capital, what do I mean by human capital? So by human capital, I think I can summarize it in this sentence. You can create as many companies as you want, but if there is not a good team to run them, then don't bother. Yeah? And the problem is that good teams that really know how to run companies and take them from, say, seed funding or Series A to Series B, Series C, it's very hard to find a talented management team. So that is probably, it's one of the things that is seldom acknowledged, but it's one of the biggest problems that you have in this space. Let me give you an example. In New York, there's this drive to turn it into a biotech city to compete with Boston and with San Francisco. In New York, there's a lot of good science, right? There's 6, 7 great universities. There's money. There's now more money than there's ever been before. But where is the management? It's very difficult to find good managers to create these companies. And you would say, okay, let's attract managers from Boston so that they move down to New York. Well, think about it. If you already have your life organized in Boston and there are all of these opportunities, why are you moving your family to New York? What if this company fails? Where are you going to go if it fails? It's difficult to convince somebody to say, okay, come to New York to start this new company that I have. So that is a pretty big challenge for any city that wants to create an ecosystem that advances biotech. Now, you can always say that there are a lot of people with experience. For example, here in Singapore, several companies have closed their shops and moved out. So there are a lot of people with pharma experience, and we have enough management to get it rolling with forming companies. That may be true that there are people with experience, but experience is not the same as success. What exactly what does it mean that somebody has 20 years of pharma experience? How many drugs did you take to the market during those 20 years? What is your legitimate track record? Yeah, so to me, this person has a lot of experience is somewhat meaningless, quite frankly. Of course, I introduced the word success in that sentence. So how does one define success? So in the last part of the talk, I will talk a little bit about different ways in which one can define success, which I think are important for an audience like the one here in Singapore. So one way to define success is by economic growth and job creation. If that's the main metric, then what you do want to do is launch companies, right? Because that's going to create jobs and stimulate the economy, right? So if that's how you're measuring success here in Singapore, that's what you probably need to do. If you're doing it for the international prestige, that's fine. That's fine. Then continue investing in science, organize events so that people come and see what you're doing, and try to become more of a player. But is that what people want, really, when thinking about making noise in this space? I don't know. The other thing is, well, we want to really come up with therapeutic advances. We really want to develop drugs, actually, because this is something that we believe in. We want to take more drugs to the market. That's great. That's great. Is launching companies the best way to achieve that? I would argue that it isn't, and I'll explain why in a second. But the important question then ultimately is that one. What does the university want? What does your institution want? And what does the country really want? I've been to Singapore several times now. This is like the fourth time I come. And I still don't have a clear answer in my head, right? For Singapore, what does success look like? And I've spoken to several people about this in very candid ways. And I don't know that there's a clear answer. This is what we want from biomedicine in Singapore. I think to me that is a key question to ask. And once you have the answer to that question, then you can see what the best model to answer it might be. So some additional considerations for Singapore, right? So I was saying earlier that the money is located in Boston, in San Francisco, and the sophisticated investors are over there, et cetera, et cetera. So one problem is the distance, I reckon. So bringing people from so far away to here, it's hard work, right? So how many times can you really bring the people here so that they see what you're doing and what you're building? Well, maybe once, maybe twice, but it cannot be something sustainable unless you have really something that people need to come and see every 6 months, every year, right? To me, it's very clear. The other problem in Singapore is that there's a lot of competition from other Asian countries. We just heard some presentations from colleagues from South Korea, from colleagues from China. Today we didn't hear from anybody from Japan, but believe me, they also are doing good stuff over there. We heard from our colleagues from Australia. In New Zealand, there are people also trying to do this. So all of these people are trying to attract the attention from investors globally. How do you compete with these people when you are a relatively small country, right? So how exactly can you compete? Somebody over lunch was making this comment that the number of people who are born in Singapore every year is in the order of 120,000. The number of PhDs granted in China per year is 120,000. So that is quite sobering, I think. So it's something worth thinking about when thinking, well, where exactly do we want to go with this thing of biomedicine? And the other thing that is related to this is Singapore a must-have or a nice-to-have? In other words, in the great scheme of what's happening in the world of biomedicine, is Singapore a mandatory stop by anybody who wants to know what's happening, who wants to have access to top talent, to top science? Or is something that, yeah, it's nice to have, right? So I would say that at this point, it's probably nice to have as opposed to must have. And the question then becomes, what is your USP? USP is a marketing term, which means unique selling point, right? What is your unique selling point? What would you put on the table and say, this is the one thing that Singapore has that nobody else has, right? If you don't know what that is, I don't know what that is. If you don't know what that is, I think it's worth thinking about it. Crucial in my head anyway. So this brings me to almost the end of the presentation. I told you it wouldn't be 1 hour, Andy. I hope you're happy. And to summarize it, this is the question that I think is worth pondering. How to compete in the global arena. So you can build your own ecosystem, which is one of the things that I've been hearing about today. Again, I put those considerations earlier. You need to sort out the question of how do you attract top talent to manage your companies? How do you attract enough money for early stage ventures? How do you identify the top science that needs to be commercialized? So it's hard work, but it's possible. If you ultimately decide you don't want to build your own ecosystem, you can just export your intellectual property, right? You could talk to the Boston guys and say, oh, we have these great projects that we can launch into companies. Maybe you want to take them to Boston and launch them there. Something tells me you wouldn't like that, but certainly it's a possibility. Another one is, okay, what is our one area where we're really, really, really very good, and let's just focus on that. Again, returning to this numbers game of the number of PhDs in China versus the number of people being born in Singapore, just the sheer amount of people that you have here is very small. So why not focus on 1 or 2 areas that are your best areas and take it from there? For example, ophthalmology. That's a formidable area of research in Singapore. Maybe that's the area that you can develop as your USP. Why not? But this is certainly something worth considering. Now, another way to think about this is to turn it on its head and say, okay, so from the 3 ingredients that we talked about, which one is the easiest to come by, right? And which one is the hardest to come by? And you'll see in a minute why I think this is important. I would argue that the easiest ingredient to have, to actually get access to, is the science. Even though there's not a lot of science in the world, there's about enough so that's kind of the easiest thing to have access to. The second easiest is the money. And the hardest is the human capital. So if you're going to not have access to a lot of human capital, then maybe you can come up with a different formula such that you don't need so much human capital, and with a small team, you can develop all of the drug development opportunities that are generated by your scientists, right? So to close, in the last slide, I want to talk about this idea of how could you turn Singapore as a drug discovery hub in Asia? What would you need for that, right? And to get to that point, let me start by saying that there's a big push around the world for what people call academic drug discovery. So some institutions want to learn how to develop drugs, and there's something called the Academic Drug Development Consortium, ADDC. So you can go check their website. It's a list of about 120 institutions, all of which tell you that they can do drug discovery. If you actually go to each of them and you see what they can do, you see that they really can't do drug discovery. They can do a little bit of drug discovery, but not that much. There are some exceptions, but but by and large, it's aspirational, I would argue. So what that means is that most of the people who are getting into this space are doing it, but they are not doing it correctly. However, there are some pretty good examples of people who have cracked this problem and who have been doing it successfully. So one example, the logo is there, is this group called LifeArc, which used to be MRC Technology. So these guys, they do academic drug discovery. I'm not going to talk about their model in detail, but they do what you could call academic drug discovery. And from the molecules they've invented, 4 of them have made it to the market, right? And that, to me, is how many people can say that, oh yeah, from what we've been doing, we've taken 4 molecules to the market, other than a big pharma. It's not very common, but these people have cracked that problem. And what they're doing is they've taken a very disciplined approach to drug discovery. So to me, this is an emerging field, academic drug discovery. There's an opportunity still to become a leader in this space, but then the definition of success here is having drugs in the market. There will be economic benefits, but it won't be the same as job creation and as economic development. It's a different kind of benefit, which has some economic development as well, but it's a different kind of success. That's why I was saying 2 slides ago, how do we want to define success? But to me, a country like Singapore, where you have relatively limited human capital to launch companies, but you have enough science and enough money, maybe the opportunity is to become an academic drug discovery hub that would serve all of Asia, right? Not only Singapore.